Hi, everyone. My name is Ben Lau, Executive Director of the Chinese American Museum of Chicago. I welcome you all to this event. We are the only Chinese American museum in the Midwest. Our mission is to advance the appreciation of Chinese American culture through exhibition, education, and research, and to preserve the past, present, and future of Chinese Americans, primarily in the Midwest. And we are very excited to present to you today a book talk by Ed Shew. The title of the book is Chinese Brothers, American Sons, which is about two Chinese brothers who arrived in America in 1854 on a death ship to escape poverty and oppression in China, Chang and Li Yu. 10 years younger, searched for Gold Mountain. Fighting the inhumanity and discrimination of the West, they work perilously to drive in the golden spike in 1869 and become inspirational builders of the first Transcontinental Railroad in this country. This book talk is hosted by us with the support of MacArthur Treehouse Foundation, Crown Family, philanthropies, and other donors. And I would like to thank our board president, Ed Shew, Vice President Mabel Menard, who is also chair of our public programming committee, and other board directors working with me to make this event possible. Ed Shew was born in 1949 in St. Louis, Missouri, the son of Chinese parents. Ed grew up in the city of St. Louis and is married with two sons. Moving to be closer to some of their grandchildren, he and his wife, Joanne, now live just west of St. Louis in St. Charles County, Missouri. In his spare time, Ed is engaged in social justice activities for his church and the community. In addition, he's a devoted fan of St. Louis Cardinals baseball team.
Oh my God, oh my God.
Before we start the book talk, I would like to let you know that this event is being recorded. If you do not want to have your face recorded, please turn off your camera. Also, please mute your mic during the presentation. In the meantime, you can type in your questions in the chat box. There will be a Q&A session after Ed's presentation. Thank you so much for your cooperation. Tonight's event is free to attend. Please consider making a donation to our museum through the link that I will post in the chat later. Support our effort on creating quality public programming and new exhibitions.
Oh my God.
Now, Ed, you have the floor.
Okay, can you hear me now?
Yes.
Okay. Thank you, Mr. Lau and the Chinese American Museum of Chicago.
Mr. Li, 你可不可以派
Thanks for inviting me to participate in your celebration of Asian American Pacific Islander Heritage Month. Call them the Silent Spikes, the Army of Canton, or the Railroad Chinese. I don't think it's an overstatement to say the Chinese built the railroad and the railroad built America. However, no firsthand account describing the lives of these Chinese railroad workers of the first Transcontinental Railroad has ever been found. We've searched the nation and the winding road back to China to the roots of these forgotten invisible men. Many were literate, yet not a scrap of their writing remains. The reason is that almost every Chinese community in the Western United States in the 19th century suffered destruction. Fire and forced expulsion was their lot in life. They were barred from obtaining citizenship. Furthermore, the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882 prohibited further immigration, which prevented many railroad workers from reconnecting with their families. There was a recent article in the Smithsonian Magazine, and they reported that Many of these workers returned to China facing challenges of their own, sometimes preferring not to speak about their experiences. In time, personal histories recorded in diaries or letters home were lost, or were likely destroyed during the Chinese Cultural Revolution in 1966, when such documents could have been branded as nationalist and disloyal to the communist government. With this book, I hope to help people understand the racism and the demonization that the Chinese went through, all the hardships and struggles they endured when searching for gold and building the railroad. While not America's finest moment in the treatment of the Chinese, it was a defining moment in American history. The Transcontinental Railroad laid the foundation for the extraordinary economic prosperity enjoyed by the United States in the years that followed. In addition, the research and writing of this novel enabled me to kind of go back to my roots, a journey I regret not traveling earlier. I understood that race had to be an integral part of the history, where we have been as a country, and where we need to go. I've essentially combined two books. First, the novel, Li Chang and his younger brother Li Yu make their way through American culture and prejudices. The second is the history, the search for gold, and how Chinese railroad crews laid track in impossible conditions to unite America in the wake of the Civil War. As a Chinese American, my goal was to tell a little known story of these brave adventurers. The work is especially relevant now, as countless Asians face so much hostility and prejudice, being blamed for a pandemic that has devastated the world. Throughout, I've tried to intertwine the parable of Confucius into the lives of the Li brothers, and perhaps into my life as well. It reads, "A man of humanity is one who, in seeking to establish himself, finds a foothold for others, and who, in desiring to attain for himself, helps others to attain." So again, slide one is this book cover that was by my brother John, did the image of that. And slide two, I just, if I could put the book into 8 images, I just kind of created this collage. In any case, let me get started. In the 1850s, China was a poverty-stricken and violent land, a place characterized by a series of political upheavals, drought, opium addiction, disease, and starvation. The gap between the rich and poor was a virtual chasm. In this environment, Li Chang encourages his younger brother, Li Yu, to leave his family to strike it rich, hopefully in California, and to provide for his family, and to seek adventure in California's Gold Mountain. For Li Yu, he's in an arranged marriage. It was customary to marry a local woman to encourage him to father a child in the months or even weeks before they left. And there were 2 purposes for that: obligation for him to send money back, and a guarantee for him to preserve the ancestral bloodline. So they left Canton, China, left behind their mother, Chang Yi, and pregnant wife, Sun Wei. Slide 3 shows a simple pencil drawing transformed into the image on the book cover with Li Yu wearing a cowboy hat. In the background and foreground are images of the American flag and of a railroad engine. Again, these are prepared by my brother, John. And I should point out, the images you're going to see in the slideshow, I gathered them from a variety of sources. I'll just point out the ones that were prepared by my brother. Slide 4. This is, again, Li Chang, Li Yu. I explore their joys and sorrows, and most importantly, their brotherhood and relationship with each other. And an important component of the book is always the food. For Li Yu, it's a coming of age story. It's a hint of a love story, and he vows into a confident guiding force of the Chinese railroad workers. The book is somewhat biographical too. Relationship with the brothers. I know in the beginning, Li Yu looks up to his brother, older brother, Li Chang. By the end of the book, Li Chang now looks up to his younger brother, Li Yu. Slide 5. Again, this is Confucius, and there is that parable there. I think the parable sets a tone of humility and brotherhood, and two virtues that weren't always present in their brothers' harsh American lives. Here we have in slide 6, it's what I call a death ship. Disease and starvation took over. Once they could hear the sound of rats scurrying about the ship's hull. Later, those sounds were gone. The rats had been eaten. They arrived in San Francisco. 180 passengers survived. That's 1/5 of who started the trip. So throughout this whole journey and throughout much of the book, Li Chang wonders, did he make the right decision in bringing his younger brother over? And it's also a story of the brothers' growing love for their new home, though, and the opportunities it offers. Now, slide 7, when they arrive in San Francisco, well, really no welcome. They're really met with a mixture of curiosity, disdain, and even hatred. The Chinese men soon realized that the streets weren't littered with gold like they thought they would be. Instead, they saw horse droppings, rats feasting on garbage, broken bottles. For Chinese men, this is a broken bachelor society. So slide 8. Li Yu catches a glimpse of Wang Wei on the ship from China to San Francisco. He wonders, what's she doing there? He's a rather naive 16-year-old boy. So Li Chang tells him that she'll probably be sold to wealthy Americans or sold as a prostitute. So now they arrive in San Francisco, and on the first day, Li Yu sees Wang Wei in this basement. I call it this a platform of surrender. She's about to be auctioned off. Li Yu, their eyes meet again as they did on the boat coming over from China. I don't know, perhaps it's love at first sight. But anyway, Li Chang wrestles him away. So again, in these days, the men who immigrated from China were disillusioned, but the women faced a far worse fate. Many were illiterate, unable to recognize the fact that the contracts they signed were not for marriage, but for prostitution. So I have a number of slides about some of the mining activities. Slide 9, the rocker was used a lot. It could be disassembled and carted away very quickly. Slide 10 is a map of the region, and the red dot indicates where gold was first found. Slide 11, just a photo of some white and Chinese miners. And slide 12, some examples of different types of mining, whether it's placer mining and using the cradle or the rocker again, a long tom, and sluice is a combination of long toms combined into a long contraption. And slide 13, later on, they decided to work for a company rather than as individuals. Again, they found that this country didn't have many women, and miners were forced to cook, wash, and sew. And so many of the Chinese saw this as an economic opportunity. These activities that were traditionally considered women's work, they started doing things like this. Unfortunately, this kind of stereotype the Chinese as being servile and treated just like women, which wasn't very good in those days. But however, though, Li Chang did get the idea that he could supplement his gold mining by cooking. Slide 14. Again, this shows the violence of the times. The Chinese might be depicted as either feminine or violent, accused of spreading disease. That sounds a little bit familiar with the Chinese virus and the Kung flu. Slide 15. So, Li Yu said that we have not much of a chance at all, a Chinaman's chance. The Chinese were different from other immigrants. The bizarre language, the script, their hair, the hue, their clothes, the food they ate, small of stature. And so you can see that the gold mining west was filled with inhumanity and murder and disease. In fact, the life expectancy within 6 months, 1 in 5 miners was dead. mostly due to chronic diarrhea and dysentery. They might be taken to some filthy hospital to die there. However, the Chinese weren't even allowed to enter a hospital by California law. Medicine is primitive, a lot of alcoholism, suicide, prostitution, gambling rampant. However, the Chinese to drink lots of hot tea instead of stream water, took baths, their better hygiene helped them to stay healthier. One other thing of note is that 219 homicides were reported in the first 6 months in 1855 in California. And again, that's only reported. So to change their luck, they adopted wearing a cowboy hat instead of their straw conical hat. And throughout this whole period, they're kind of questioning themselves, because in China culture, there's more respect for persons of authority. But Li Yu discovered that individualism is part of American culture, and assertiveness is needed for communication. But that was very hard to do, because there was a Supreme Court rule in California, People versus Hall, in which a Chinese person couldn't testify against a white person. Therefore, white miners would steal their claims, beat and rob them, and even murder them. Nothing was done to the whites that did that. There was also the foreign miners tax that stipulated every Chinese miner working claim must pay a monthly license fee, which was arbitrarily increased over the next few years. So, again, throughout, there's all these conflicts, internal conflicts. Li Yu is getting homesick. I don't look Chinese anymore, but they're still able to send money home to China. Slide 16. Again, the Chinese really weren't welcome. Almost every Chinese community in the Western United States in the 19th century suffered destruction. And as I kind of repeated or stated earlier, fire and forced expulsion, were their way of life. Slide 17. That's my pet, Roscoe. He actually was in the book, and then he kind of suddenly left. I had to edit the book out. The publisher said I had to cut the book down, so Roscoe was taken out. Slide 18. Again, image of Wang Wei, forbidden love, something that, again, conflict with Li Yu. He was guilty because he was still married. Throughout the book, I used the moon to link Li Yu to Wang Wei. And I know in my research, the role of the moon has played an important role in Chinese culture. I call it a carrier of emotions, especially for loved ones. Chang and Li Yu didn't realize that they realized there weren't very few Chinese women in the country, but they didn't realize there were hardly any women. In fact, in the mining region, 2 out of every 100 were female. But Li Yu, still thinking of Wang Wei, he kept up this fool's game of looking for her. In his spare time, he sometimes visited mining and Chinatown brothels, searching for her. Slide 19. Again, the Chinese food culture, it's really important. And that was in the way Li Chang, I guess, his quest for humanity. So he opens a humble restaurant in an alley in San Francisco, Chinatown. As depicted here, there was no elegant restaurant for Li Chang, and one of the reasons was he did have a bit of a gambling problem, and he squandered a lot of his money that way. But again, doing some research, I know Confucius would say that army, trust, and food are basic conditions of life, and that giving and sharing foods brought about peace and harmony. One of the other things he said was to never eat alone. So examples of this are, for example, on the ship, Li Chang saved the ship's captain from a crew's mutiny by cooking for the sailors in exchange for extra time on the deck and more rice. And go search for Gold Mountain, searching for gold. He discovered the coffee is either weak or too strong. Steaks were either raw or burnt to a crisp, and potatoes sort of like mush or hard as a rock. So he wanted change all that. So he opened that restaurant to bring people together. I know when my father was moved into a senior facility, my mother, he would cook Americanized Chinese food like sweet and sour pork, chicken sub yum, to try and connect with his white senior citizens. So Li Chang had found his niche in life as a restaurant. He wasn't so ambivalent about staying in America like some other Chinese. Plus his queue was cut off by some bushwhackers, and so that meant he couldn't return to China. There's a lot of talk about, the conflict, and there's a tug of war between the old and the new. And I know Li Chang would tell his brother that, ethnic history is either told as a sentimental romance, like Gold Mountain, or a litany of the wrongs done to the newcomers, and he would say it's probably somewhere in between. And Li Yu, again, very conflicted. And he said he sometimes wished he was white, and his self-esteem and his Chinese identity wasn't there, and he felt like a failure. And, Li Chang would always be uplifting, and he would say, well, I know you have pride in yourself and your heritage, but when being Chinese is devalued by society, the task is much harder. Anyway, so Li Chang would even say to Li, perhaps you should go home. His wife wanted him there. But Li Yu reminded Li Chang, his brother, that he had promised to help him find Wong Wei. So with a month's profit from the restaurant, he asked the Chinese six companies, that's a benevolent association, to look for Wong Wei. And he had been sending letters to her while he was gold mining. And I guess they actually found one of the letters that she had sent. It was never delivered to Li Yu, but the date was indecipherable, but said that she was still alive. And she once lived in Placerville. And now she was moving to Sacramento. So, Li Yu now has a little bit of hope that she may still be alive. And he also says he'd feel like a coward if he went back to China now. So they took a detour to Sacramento, and Li Yu persuaded Li Chang to look for Wong Wei. So they would ask passersby if there were any white men with Chinese wives or Chinese servants. They came up empty-handed. However, while in Sacramento, they saw the groundbreaking ceremony of the western portion of the Transcontinental Railroad. And Li Yu became intrigued by what he saw, and they didn't have any experience in this type of labor, but they certainly had experience in backbreaking labor in rural China and working gold mines. So he said to his brother Li Chang, well, let's join the railroad. I think you could cook food for the Chinese there, and aren't you getting tired of cooking chop suey for whites? Anyway, so here we have in slide 21, we have the beginning of the joining of America from sea to shining sea. This is a mural is in Sacramento's Amtrak station. And the groundbreaking ceremony is in January of 1863. And so Li Chang says to Li Yu, little brother, you follow me to Gold Mountain. I'll be by your side as we help build the path for the fireway. So before the Transcontinental Railroad, to get from east to the West Coast, either 5 or 6 months of misery and by horse and wagon, and very dangerous disease, Native Americans, mountaineers, wild animals, starvation, thirst, the desert, so on and so forth. But what was needed was a railroad to move more people west and the natural resources. And then it would open up major markets back east. So they joined the railroad in the spring of 1864. They were the first of the Chinese workers. Slide 22. In March of 1965, the Central Pacific employed 50 Chinese workers to break a strike by the white workers. The construction superintendent, James Strobridge, had many doubts. Don't they average about 120 pounds? They're only about 4'10". Chinese are too effeminate. to do a real man's work, too delicate, too small of hands. And one of the directors of Central Pacific Railroad, Charles Crocker, reminded them that they built the Great Wall of China, the biggest piece of masonry in the world. You know, they were thinking all Chinese looked alike, so they couldn't tell them apart. So they devised a scheme to pay them in teams of 12 to 20 men, a head man and a cook. And so eventually another 50 Chinese were hired, then another 50, and eventually thousands were hired. But the white workers were very resentful of the skill and strength of what they called little yellow men. They called them midgets and monkeys. But white workers were placated somewhat, that only whites could be foremen, who were paid several times more than the laborers. So slide 23. The Army of Canton conquered the back-breaking construction of the Transcontinental Railroad, the granite tunnels of the Sierras. And I know that the principal topographical feature with the American Far West were the Sierras. So it had, it rose from 1,000 feet on its western slopes to over 10,000 feet, with many peaks exceeding 14,000 feet. And many of the summits were enveloped in glaciers. So the Chinese railroad workers had to face the high Sierras with the terrible weather, 30 to 100-foot snow drifts, mudslides, and find a way to dig deep rock cuts and tunnel through it all. Slide 24. You can see here how the mountain was sculpted, and the plan was to bridge rivers and ravines and carve 20-foot wide shelves out of sheer mountain faces and cut numerous tunnels. One of them was the Summit Tunnel, more than 1,600 feet long through solid granite. So when all was said and done, the rail bed was sculpted out of the face of sheer rock that was Cape Horn. And this work took a year, and more than 300 Chinese fell to their deaths in the process. Slide 25. Now, there are very few images in the book, except the ones done by my brother. I wanted to have an image like this in there so people could get an idea of what they were doing. So this shows how there were 4 separate headings. Started digging or drilling, or not drilling, it's by hand, both sides of the summit. And to facilitate, they made a hole down the middle so they could start digging from the inner part of the mountain. And again, throughout all of this, there's still a conflict of Li Yu gets letters from his wife saying, "You can help me by preserving what we have. Stay and be safe in San Francisco." Slide 26. Again, there's some images of the Summit Tunnel. It took 15 months to complete, and the danger and increased demands upon the Chinese workers eventually led them to a strike. I'll just read one or two quotes from the book. And the tunnel whispered, but it was just the sound of their feet avoiding scummy patches of ice. The tunnel was like a giant flute, and snow tunnels 50 to 500 feet in length were constructed to connect the outside world in the granite tunnel. They walked to and from work inside the snow tunnels, and there they endured their long, grueling shifts in a dim, dank world of smoky lights, ear-ringing explosions, and choking dust. The mountain that was 1 million years old was locked against them and was not to be broken into. By the dim, flickering glow of sunlight, many, even the strongest, fainted from exhaustion. Again, Li Yu's thoughts drift to long way, but he still continued to send money home to Sunway and the sun, but his heart was elsewhere. Slide 27. Again, part of the Summit Tunnel. Unfortunately, nowadays, a lot of people are not showing much respect for its location, vandalism, and things like that. So I know there's an effort to preserve historical value of the Summit Tunnel. But throughout all of this, again, another element of the book is the importance of food. So I know it kept hope for the Chinese workers. And for example, Li Yu might whisper in Li Chang's ear, anybody can make you enjoy the first bite of a dish, but only a great chef can make you enjoy the last. And so they would do that often, and they'd raise their teacups and look forward to another day of work. One day, slide 28, one day after an explosion that killed a couple of workers, Li Chang suffered a head injury. Li Yu balked at returning to the tunnel, and Li Yu proudly said, "I'm a free man. Isn't this a country where you fight wars to be free?" And the foreman raised and lowered his whip, and he said, "Not on my mountain." And then he proceeded to make Li Yu scream, and then he whipped him to make him shut up. They introduced the directors of the Central Pacific now started using nitroglycerin, and it made the progress much faster, but much more dangerous. And the Central Pacific drove them even harder, working Chinese 7 days a week in 12-hour shifts. But this time, one of the friends that, a white friend that Li met when he first arrived in San Francisco, now began work on the railroad, and sent him a note talking about the wage disparity. And I think that the Chinese railroad workers thought that was the case, but they weren't quite sure. Anyway, so throughout this, again, Li Chang is ever the philosopher, is saying things like, well, I should back up. Li Yu asked his brother one time, "You want a brother who has the guts to fight back?" And Li Chang says, "No, I want a brother who has the guts not to fight back." Well, of course, Li Yu didn't listen, because he started a strike regarding the wage disparity and the working conditions. And at the time, 3,000 of the 10,000 that were employed at that time took part in the strike, especially the indispensable tunnel men. And Li Yu wanted to make the work shifts in the tunnel only 8 hours, and the work shifts outside the tunnel 10 hours. But the director, Charles Crocker, he said he would reduce the hours in the tunnel from 12 to 10, and outside the tunnel to 12-hour shifts. But Central Pacific, they reacted very swiftly and ruthlessly. They starved out the Chinese, and so the strike ended on the 9th day. There was a small victory for the Chinese, from $30 to $35 a month increase. However, additional research, this is after I completed the book, additional research indicates that the pay disparity was even greater. The Chinese laborers made $35 a month, but the white laborers actually were making $75 a month, not $35, $40 that we once thought. But there's some evidence that experienced and more skilled Chinese laborers did get more than $35 a month. But again, in this historical novel, I show that Li Yu inspires his work crew to be assertive and be proud. And when they completed 8-hour shifts in the tunnel and 10-hour shifts outside the tunnel, Li Yu told them the shift's over. With pride and defiance, they triumphantly headed back to camp. So Li Yu has evolved from a scared, unsure boy to a confident guiding force for the Chinese railroad workers. So in slide 29, Li Yu's words meant a lot to them. So eventually all the Chinese railroad crews of the Central Pacific Railroad followed Li Yu's lead, 8-hour shifts in the tunnel and 10-hour shifts outside the tunnel. So again, Li Chang really just so proud of his younger brother. And I know one time they were coming back to camp, and so he says something like, "I remember when you were younger, you lived in my shadow. Now I live in your glow." Slide 30. This is an example of the train sheds, and so much of their work was digging out of avalanches and removing snow from the tracks. And so Li Yu had proposed to Charles Crocker and one of the directors of the railroad and superintendent of construction, Strobridge, that they should cover the tracks. And so 55 miles of train sheds were put over the tracks in one stretch, as many as 28 miles. Avalanche is always a problem. One day, described in the novel, they were asked for volunteers. So Li Yu and his friend Jimmy Smith decided to go up there and set a charge, start an avalanche that was threatening the other workers. Yeah, they marched through the snow. Snow fell into their boots, their chilled feet stiff as wood, and the hill got steeper and steeper. They were able to resolve that matter. Again, there's some elements in the book that I won't go into. But anyway, so slide 31. This is an interesting image. So here the Chinese laborers shake their fists at a train emerging from a snow shed. It's unclear whether they cheer their accomplishments or jeer at the system that subjects them to such difficult labor and inhumane practices. And slide 32 is the 40-mile desert. So this was in the summer of 1868 with 5,000 workers and 400 horses. At least it was flat, though, unlike the mountains. But it was so hot that they couldn't even remember their name, and water had to be hauled 50 miles away. Li Chang said, well, "This is the end of the earth, a hellhole choking every hole in my body." And the air was so thin they even got nosebleeds. On slide 33, Li Yu comes. He's the son. He's now 15. Li Yu is 30. His first job as a water boy, and from there he got to see every part of the rail laying operation. Li Yu had never seen a black man before, and the one he assisted in getting water to the railroad workers was Tommy Merton. And so one day he asked him, "Why are whites calling me chink and laughing at the way I talk?" And so Merton grabbed a rope and formed a noose, and his comment was, "My daddy was lynched." So Li Yu really, he understood. He didn't bring that subject up again. But again, Li Yu ends up wanting to be a spiker. That was kind of like it's more the elite job of working on the railroad. And slide 34 is Hell on Wheels. That was a little town that accompanied them all along the rails up and down. It was, and I don't know if anyone saw the AMC movie Hell on Wheels. The last season had the Chinese role in building the Transcontinental Railroad. But that was, this town offered a quartet of vices: gambling, opium, alcohol, and brothels. I described the scene of the Newtown Massacre. I created this for the novel. It actually happened in a Wyoming mining town. That's when 25 Chinese were killed, and bodies were thrown into the flames of the burning buildings, and they were scalped and mutilated and brain and decapitated and dismembered. Slide 34 is just something I'd indicated before. It shows a water train. You had to go 50 miles to bring in water. Slide 35 is the map of the route. And throughout the whole book, there's talk about empathy and how important that was, and climbing inside someone else's skin and walking in their shoes. There's not Chinese would remain isolated, alien, and segregated. And so I know Li Ken Kwok, I should say this. Li Chang says to his brother, "I wish to give you a new name, Li Ken Kwok, which means build the country. This is what you have accomplished. Remember that always that we built this nation's railroads. This country broke the boy in you, but it couldn't break the man that you have become." And there's, again, a lot of philosophical kinds of comments. And so, for example, now Li Ken Kwok tells his son Li Yu, "Don't be me, son, be better than me. If your friend is picked on by a bully and you just stand there and do nothing, you may as well stand with the bully." So there's a lot of things like that. You know, some might say I'm a little too preachy, but you know, I put things like that in the book. Slide 36. Again, the railroads, they were trying to outdo each other, and towards the end, they would even put like tracks alongside each other, and sometimes even cross. When the Union Pacific did that, they wouldn't. They'd purposely fire the blast without warning, whereas the Chinese would give a warning first. One day, though, there's an example of Li Yu didn't always turn the other cheek. There was an avalanche that injured his brother Li Chang, and you know, Li Yu snapped, and he said he had to do something. And these men understand only violence. So he set up a grave, a mysterious blast, a dynamite charge that killed an Irishman and buried several Irishmen alive. Slide 37. Again, 10 miles in one day. This is considered impossible. This record has still never been beaten. They laid track in 10 miles in one day. Charles Crocker had one last thing to prove to the Union Pacific. You know, they'd built tunnels through granite, and overcame fierce blizzards and snow drifts, 100 feet avalanches that swept away whole crews. But he wanted to show the Union Pacific, so he got together 1,400 Chinese and 8 Irishmen, and that actually is the correct number. To make that up, and so they worked and constructed 10 miles of track in one day. The record still stands. So you know, they're coming home from that, and Li Kin Kwok is squeezing his son's hands and said, on this day, white and yellow work together. However, that was pretty short-lived. But the Union Pacific leader was not a good loser. He begged for permission to tear up several miles of track in order to prove it. But the president of the Union Pacific said no. And slide 38. Again, long way, never far from thoughts. Slide 39. Here's the golden spike hammer did by Leland Stanford. And you know, again, many say that without the Chinese workers, there might not even be Stanford University, because Leland Stanford got much of his wealth on the backs of the Chinese laborers. Slide 40. This is an iconic photo which shows the joining of the railroads on May 10th, 1869, and you can see there no Chinese workers are present. Slide 41. Nowhere to go. Again, after the railroad was completed, many of the Chinese weren't even given passage back to San Francisco. And again, at its peak, probably 90% of the 12,000 laborers were Chinese, and it's estimated that a minimum of 1,200 died. Slide 42. Again, originally 6 months to get across this country. Now it took six days. Slide 43. We can't forget that the fate of the Native Americans. That was the buffalo that they used for food and clothing. They almost became extinct with the railroads coming through. You know, I mean, look at this one Native American. He's probably wondering what is going to happen. What's his fate? And slide 44. Yeah, things really didn't get any better for the Chinese. And I know, for example, in 1871, Chinatown Massacre. And slide 45, it really is the largest mass lynching in the United States. Was 18 Chinese were hung in 1871. And another thing on slide 46, we see how the Chinese are accused of stealing American jobs. Still hear that refrain nowadays. Again, many people were unemployed, and Dennis Carney, an Irish immigrant, would always start his rallies with the Chinese must go. Slide 47. Again, these are cartoons of the time. Shows the Chinese soon invade America like grasshoppers. And then slide 48. This is very interesting, this cartoon. Well, interesting, probably not the best word, but this is even before there was a Statue of Liberty. But you can see that emanating, some beams emanating from this image of a Chinese person. It's called a statue for a harbor, and it talks about filth and immorality and diseases, and the ruins of white labor. And again, slide 49, of course, is the Chinese Exclusion Act, and you know, this remains the only law to have been implemented to prevent all members of a specific ethnic or national group, Chinese, from immigrating to the United States. So slide 50, again, another cartoon of the era, and Chinese label as a destroyer of women and children. Slide 51, very proud of this. Corky Lee, who is now deceased, he got everybody together and to celebrate the 150th anniversary of completion of the Transcontinental Railroad. And some of these people there are even descendants of Chinese railroad workers. And again, Corky Lee recently died, I believe, because of COVID. And alongside the iconic photo of Andrew Russell's. Slide 52. Now, Stanford University, a project led by Gordon Chang, he actually has identified, he believes two Chinese workers are in that iconic photo. But again, 2 of the thousands is really not too many, but he has identified two workers in that iconic photo. Slide 53. Again, you know, I have many Facebook friends nowadays, more than I used to, and I know a lot of Chinese Asian people are even afraid still to go out. I was so the poison really is not disappeared, and we have the racially charged, you know, so the Chinese virus and the Kung flu. And I think I read a poll recently that 1/5 of Americans believe that Chinese Americans have more reliance with China than the United States. And Asian hate crimes have reached unprecedented levels, with an increase by 339% in 2021 compared to 2020. So there are many that still believe Chinese are perpetual foreigners. That's slide 54, right? Slide 55 is just a bunch of food items, and so all of these foods are actually mentioned in the book, and you know, that's what I recall growing up, and how important food was to us, and it still is. There are a couple other things, but I think, Ben, I'm finished.
Well, thank you so much, Ed. We have, you know, about 10 minutes for the Q&A sessions. And again, thank you so much. Let me first relate a question in the chat to you first. There's a couple of questions in the chat that people would like to ask. The first question from the chat would be from Grace Wenhua. Wing Yuan, I think it's Wing Yuan. So are any of the infamous anti-Chinese advocates descendants around? I'm sorry, can you repeat that? I'm sorry. Yes, are there any infamous anti-Chinese advocates descendants around?
Well, there are, excuse me. Okay. My wife was here, so okay. There are descendants of Chinese railroad workers, if that's the question. I know I even have a couple of Facebook friends that are descendants of Chinese railroad workers. I think Raymond Douglas Chong is one of them. So unfortunately, though, we still don't have any letters or diaries from you know, an actual participant, you know, a worker. But yes, there are descendants of Chinese railroad workers. So one day, hopefully, that we will find that letter or diary somewhere.
Well, what about those anti-Chinese advocates, descendants? Those advocates, to anti-Chinese. Do you know any descendants of those people?
Oh, the people who are anti-Chinese.
Yeah.
No, I don't. No, I don't know anybody like that. Certainly, the violence, whether Atlantic slings or whatever, it's still, there's a lot of that around. Unless I'm misunderstanding the question.
Okay, so I think there's only one questions in the chat. Now, all the participants, you can, if you have any questions, please take this opportunity to ask, Ed. You can turn on your video and turn on your mic. Or if you would rather turn on your mic without turning on your camera, it's okay too. So any questions from the audience?
Yes, hi. This is Grace Toy. Hi.
Hi, Grace.
And so my second question is why did you specifically highlight Chinese railroad workers for this book? Like why specifically this part of our Chinese American history?
Well, when I first started doing some research, for example, I didn't know that over 20% of the gold miners were Chinese, but Stanford University, I retired. I was fortunate to retire early in 2011, and in 2012, I discovered that Stanford University was doing a railroad project because they couldn't find any firsthand accounts of the Chinese railroad workers. So they started this project, and they worked on it for about 9 years, and they still haven't found any. They're still looking, for that elusive diary or letter. But so that's why I thought, well, why don't I do a fictional account of these railroad workers, since there's no firsthand account. So that's why I chose that. The railroad workers as what I wanted to study, and I must have read about 35 books and countless websites and so on and so forth. That's why I chose that as a topic.
Great. Do you have plans for a second book?
Well, I guess I could possibly do that. Li Yu, now Li Kwok is the writer, and towards the end of the book, he decides he'll have a Chinese American newspaper to fight the discrimination against the Chinese, and his wife works to place Chinese women, either return them back to China or find jobs for them. So it's possible to do another book like that. I've also, some people suggested I should do a book related to the afterward and do little vignettes of my life or something like that, where there's my dad's love of cooking, or my mother, who was in an arranged marriage, and one of her sisters was even sold, and do something related to that, or talking about when I went to high school, I was the only Asian. So it's possible that I could do other things like that. In fact, I'm doing some writing related to that, and it's for my own personal benefit. I don't know if anything will ever come of it. And I noticed, for example, I see my old football coach was on here. I don't know if he's still here, but he certainly written some little pieces about him too. So it's possible. Yeah.
Okay, good. There are some questions from the chat. And how did you get information for the book? And how much is history and how much is myth?
Well, I've read about 30 books or so. A lot of those were fiction books. And so I gathered some things I thought were interesting and combined them into some of my book. and certainly most of this is actual is historical and true. You know, I changed some of the locations a little different. Like, for example, when I used the Newtown massacre, I took a true story of miners in Wyoming who were murdered and moved that into my story on the railroad. So that incident didn't take place, but not on the railroad, but in a mining town. So that's kind of what I did. You know, there's some other books in there about cooking and food. You know, a lot of times there really aren't original thoughts. You just kind of borrow them and paraphrase them. And so I use a lot of different sources to come up with this. But, you know, I should back up, and anybody who bought a book from me and I sent them an insert, I never had an intention to publish a book. It was just occupying myself in retirement. But my wife insisted I find someone to look at my manuscript. And so I did, and the rest is history.
Thanks. Another question is, can you describe the family associations that later formed to help the Chinese community?
I'm sorry.
Can you describe the family associations
Okay.
that formed to help the Chinese community?
But you know, the benevolent associations, and like, for example, in St. Louis, there's on Liang Association. So they were involved a lot in getting the remittances back to China, also helping people write letters back to China. And I didn't touch upon this but Li Yu was a writer, and he would write letters for people that were illiterate to write back to China. They also were involved. These Chinese benevolent associations were also involved in some prostitution, gambling, and opium and things like that. But they were the big thing, they were like allowed the immigrants to stay connected to China. And so that was the main thing. They were involved in a lot of other illegal activities, though. But certainly celebrations and things like that. Yeah. So they were very important. Chinese 6 companies, the benevolent associations. So.
Thanks. So would you consider the recent hate crime is some sort of a second-class oppression?
Well, second-class oppression, I view that as, like, for example, when I, not anymore, but when growing up, I might say, well, what happened to the Chinese people, it's not as bad as it happens to blacks, or so on and so forth. But actually, we can't be involved into, what I call second-class oppression. All oppression is bad. All racism is bad. We can't really be involved in ranking historical struggles. At one time, I think I used to do stuff like that, but I don't do that anymore. But that's why I like to point out about the mass lynching. Very few people know that the largest mass lynching in the United States was against Chinese people, 18 people. So, yeah, so that's more my definition of second-class oppression.
Okay, so another question from Barbara, and she asked about the initial Chinese generation that left for America was a sojourner one. The research indicates that the land in Taishan and surrounding counties, despite the Pearl River Delta, was rocky and swampy and not arable. Yet why did Chinese migrants send back money to buy more land? Was it a very close attachment to the land?
Boy, interesting. I'm not a historian, because my understanding, that was, I know sometimes due to over farming and flooding, maybe some of the land wasn't as fertile as it used to be. But no, again, I think a lot of it sending money back was to provide for their families. And I think at that time, sometimes too, there was this gap between the Southern peasants wanting to be, the ones who ran the country were more the Northern Chinese, Mandarin speaking. And I think there was a big thing about trying to get their sons and daughters to become, quote, Mandarin a little more. And at least some of my readings, that was the case. So that's why money was sent back. And but land, yeah, if you had some land, you know, you wouldn't be, wouldn't have to accommodate, you know, a lot of times the peasants, you know, they rented out the land. They didn't own their own, so they have their own plot of land. So that was a big part of why you sent money back.
Ed, I know some of the books were inspired by your childhood experience. Can you tell us a little bit about your childhood?
Well, you know, my dad came over this country in 1928, and he was, for people know the term paper son. He was a paper son, so he came over illegally, using someone else's name and paper. So actually, for example, my name was really a Li and not a Shew. And my mother was born in Hop Alley, Chinatown, St. Louis, and my 4 brothers and sisters were born there. I was raised in Midtown St. Louis. But my mother, she was involved in an arranged marriage. She was 15 years old. My dad was over twice as old as she when got married. Times were pretty bad. Women weren't treated very well, and like I said, her sister was even sold. My mother's sister was sold. And, you know, there weren't very many Chinese people in St. Louis at that time. I think I read something where I think Hu Pingling has a book about Chinese in St. Louis, and I think she had said in the 1930 census, for example, there were only 300 Chinese in the city of St. Louis. And so, of course, my family were probably about 5 or 6 of those with their brothers and sisters. So, I went to, I was only Chinese person, only Asian in my high school. You know, I wish I could, the little Chinese that I knew, my mom, she bilingual, but she mainly spoke English. Well, she spoke English to me. So once I started going to American school, lost the little Chinese that I knew. And, there's some stories mentioned in the afterword about the food was so foreign to me that I had to go out to recess, and so they wanted to have the plates clean. So I literally smuggled food out of my pockets and threw it into alleys. So show that the teacher I'd eaten all my food.
Okay.
Things like that.
Yeah. Okay. Thanks. I think we only have time for a couple of more questions because we already passed 3 o'clock, you know, Central Time here. One of the questions is actually picking back to the answers that you mentioned about the sending back money to China. So this question was, what's your educated guess as to what percentage of the money sent back to China was actually received?
Well, you know, I wouldn't have any idea, but again, from my readings, it seemed like I would say a pretty good percentage, but no, I don't know. I think there was a lot of loyalty and a lot of trust going on there, and you had to do that to survive. And so I would say, yeah, I would say most everything, yeah. But I don't know. Not really, no.
Okay, thanks. And I think it would be the last questions. A very interesting question indeed. And let me see. Oh, this question is, what was the form of currency sent back to China? I know, some Barbara already answered about, gold coins, but, is it actually gold coins? Not.
That was my understanding in gold, right? Because, yeah, because that's very transferable. Yeah. I know in the novel, I think he sends back gold, and then his wife made that into his ring, and it's his son Li Yu has that ring when he comes to America. And I think there's a case of one of the stories is that when they worked for a company, the one who ran that was called the Dragon, and he would send back literally gold to China. So he had them covered, blackened and made look like chopsticks. yeah, I think that was, yeah. It was done.
So they won't be, taking away a certain portion by the custom of, the Qing, government. All could be get into the hands of their families in China.
Yeah, I mean, that's what I understand. There's the intermediaries there, and they would take care of that.
Oh, okay.
You know,
Okay, thank you.
Those are good questions. So
Yeah, a very interesting one. Thank you again, Ed, for a great presentation. And thank you all for participating in this event. But don't forget to make a donation to our museum. I just posted, a link to our donation, page. And before we go, I noticed that our board president, Ed Shew, is here. Ed, do you want to say a few words before we close? Ed? Oh, okay. Maybe he's busy right now because we are having another event, at the same time. So, okay. Thank you so much for joining this event. Thank you, and goodbye, and have a great weekend. Bye bye.